released on the African Human Rights Day. Amnesty International said the mechanisms established to safeguard human rights across the continent are facing enormous challenges, and at least one is facing an existential threat. The report also states that governments have neglected the rights of people with disabilities and older persons by failing to ratify treaties relating to their protection. Dr. Japhet Biegon, who is Amnesty International's Regional Advocacy Coordinator and lead author of the report, now joins us live to discuss this report. Dr. Japhet, many thanks for joining us here on Bottomline Africa. Let's begin perhaps by laying down the mechanisms established to safeguard human rights across the continent.
Thanks, Michelle, for having me. We have 3 continental human rights bodies that have been established under the auspices of the African Union to safeguard human rights. The first and the oldest is the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, which is based in Banjul, the Gambia. The second is the African Committee of Experts on the Rights and Welfare of the Child, which is currently based in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, and will be moving to Lesotho, Maseru, very soon. And then finally is the African Court on Human and People's Rights, which is based in Arusha, Tanzania.
Right. Now, those mechanisms being stated, and given the magnitude of gross human rights violations across the continent, how important is it that we protect and fully support these mechanisms?
It is really critical that state parties to the African Union human rights instruments protect, safeguard, and finance these regional human rights institutions because they provide crucial and alternative mechanisms for justice for victims of human rights violations who have been failed at the national level. They therefore have an opportunity at the regional level to vindicate their rights. And yet, as our report clearly shows, many state parties across the continent are undermining these bodies by failing to cooperate with them in terms of providing financial resources, complying with their decisions, complying or responding to the urgent appeals of these bodies.
And according to that report by Amnesty International, of those 3 mechanisms, one faces an existential crisis, and that is the African Court on Human and People's Rights. Speak to us about the state of the African Court of Human Rights.
Yes, the future of the African Court on Human and People's Rights is indeed in a dire situation or in jeopardy. This is because just this year, 3 states, Benin, Cote d'Ivoire, and Tanzania, have withdrawn the right of individuals and non-governmental organizations to file cases directly before the African Court. And our research shows that these 3 countries did so because of a political pushback or backlash against the court for the decisions or judgments that the court had done. But one thread that also ties together these 3 countries is that we have seen deteriorating human rights situation in all the countries, especially in the context of upcoming elections in Cote d'Ivoire and Tanzania. So these countries are essentially dissatisfied or not happy with credible, reasoned judgments that the court have issued in the recent past.
Right, and of course now we're seeing African states then using political muscle against the very same institutions whose purpose is to ensure justice for everyone. But other than these 3 countries who've directly withdrawn the right for individuals and NGOs to file cases directly at the court, let's talk about other countries like Kenya and Rwanda who simply are not meeting the criteria that is intended.
Yes, indeed. Many other countries, not only in this region, but in other parts of the continent, are not meeting their obligations under the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, which as today we are celebrating its entry into force 34 years ago in 1981. One of the issues that has come up in our research is that most of these countries are not reporting to the African Commission as they are required to report. Only 6 states out of the 54 member states to the African Charter have reported to the African Commission. We also see that compliance with the decisions of all the 3 regional bodies is very low. Consider, for instance, compliance with the judgments of the African Court. So far, since the establishment of the African Court, there is only one country, Burkina Faso, which has complied fully with the judgments of the court. The rest of the countries, Kenya, Rwanda, Benin, Cote d'Ivoire, and Libya, they have not complied at all, or they have only partially complied. One other aspect is that most countries across the continent are not accepting and facilitating country visits by these bodies to visit the countries and assess the human rights situation in those countries. Also, in situations of individuals who are suffering or are under threat of irreparable harm, we see that only 4 countries accepted urgent appeals to ensure that rights of individuals are protected.
Right.
So as you rightly said, Michelle, in a continent where there is magnitude human rights violations, there is an urgent need to protect and safeguard these bodies and human rights generally.
So other than using political muscle, to get out of things like the African Court on Human Rights, there's also been compliance, lack of compliance and cooperation from states to NGOs, things like lack of updating them on national information relating to human rights, for example. Talk to us about this, how this has affected operations of human rights organizations across the continent.
Yes, so the same way that state parties are not complying with the decisions of the African Commission, the committee and the court, we see a similar trend at the national level, where non-governmental organizations and civil society generally are under attack. We see it, for instance, in Tanzania, where freedom of expression, assembly and association has been muzzled since 2015 and has heightened or escalated towards the next general election. This applies also to Benin and Cote d'Ivoire, 2 of the countries that we have reflected in the report. We have seen a shrinking of civic space, targeting of dissenting voices, political opposition and civil society. And this is a trend that cuts across. Our research shows that the African Commission in particular intervened 57% of the times that they intervened, they did so on behalf of human rights defenders. So essentially, human rights defenders across the continent are under threat. They are under attack, intimidation by law, intimidation by judicial persecution, and other mechanisms that African states are putting in place to muzzle independent voices and dissenting voices.
Right. And of course, Africa's 3 human rights bodies, like you say, had already been starved of finances and resources from respective governments. But then COVID-19 came, further exacerbating that situation. We also have Amnesty International noting that in implementing COVID-19 containment measures, many governments also had instances of human rights violations. Let's talk about the case happening in Nigeria today as we speak. How then can the African Union, for example, ensure that all these international treaties, including the African Union, the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, are binding decisions for the state parties?
The African Union has an important role to play, and especially the Executive Council of the African Union, which has the responsibility of ensuring that each and every state party complies with the decisions of the regional bodies and also the decisions of the African Union. Unfortunately, even as our inaugural report did show, the Executive Council has neglected to perform its monitoring role. And it's for this reason that Amnesty International is calling on the African Union and the Executive Council in particular to play its monitoring role and ensure that countries that are non-compliant with their obligations under the African Charter are made to comply and are pressured to do so, so that they are able to comply with all the obligations under the African Union human rights treaties.
And of course, that African Charter on Human and People's Rights will be 40 years old in 2021. Shockingly, according to this report by Amnesty International, not a single member state of the African Union has ratified the protocol on persons with disabilities in Africa 2 years after the treaty was adopted. So the rights of persons with disabilities and the rights of older persons in Africa have not been taken care of, yet these treaties have been put in place. What is the situation of these 2 groups of people?
Yes, so in many parts of the continent, the rights of older persons and the rights of persons with disabilities are neglected. And this is reflected by what we have seen in terms of the ratification rate of the relevant treaties that apply to persons with disabilities and older persons. And for this reason that we are calling on member states of the African Union to move from just mere colorful pronouncements to concrete actions in protection of human rights, especially of marginalized groups like older persons and persons with disabilities. As you rightly said, Shell, next year will be 40 years since the adoption of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. We're therefore calling on states to move from rhetoric to actually doing what is needed to be done to ensure that each and every individual across the continent, 1 billion of us, are able to enjoy our human rights.
All right, many thanks. That is Dr. Japhet Biegon. He is Amnesty International's Regional Advocacy Coordinator and the lead author of the report discussing